I smoothed the lapels of my tailored Armani suit as I watched my husband, David, hold court from across the crowded restaurant. His legal colleagues hung on his every word, nodding appreciatively at his self-congratulatory anecdotes about his latest courtroom victory. The private dining room at Bellini's, his favorite restaurant, buzzed with the particular energy of legal professionals celebrating a win, a mixture of relief, vindication, and the collective release of weeks of tension. The judge practically handed me the case the moment I presented our argument, David boasted, gesturing with his whiskey glass. Opposing counsel never stood a chance. They came in with stacks of international precedents, but none of them applied to the jurisdictional questions at hand. Classic mistake of trying to impress with volume rather than precision. I approached with a practiced smile, balancing a fresh drink for his mentor, Judge Harrison, who had become a regular fixture at these victory celebrations. The heavy crystal tumbler contained exactly 2 fingers of Macallan 25, the judge's preferred scotch that David always ensured was available, though it wasn't on Bellini's regular menu. "Ah, here's my lovely Natalie," David announced, pulling me against his side with practiced affection. His arm settled around my waist in a gesture that appeared loving to observers but felt performative to me, a husband displaying his attractive accessory. The perfect legal wife, always supportive, never asks too many questions about the boring details. Judge Harrison accepted his drink with a perfunctory nod in my direction, his eyes never quite meeting mine despite our having been introduced at least 20 times over the past 7 years. "You've got yourself a real gem, David." My Caroline was the same way, knew her place was managing our home while I handled the important work. "Exactly," David agreed, his arms still draped possessively around my shoulders. "Natalie handles all those little domestic matters so I can focus on building the firm. She tried law school herself once, didn't you, darling? Made it through a year before realizing it wasn't for her." As always when this particular fiction emerged, I maintained the pleasant expression that had become second nature at these gatherings. The story of my supposed academic failure had grown more elaborate with each telling, evolving from decided law wasn't her passion in the early days of our marriage to the current narrative of intellectual inadequacy that David seemed to prefer. David's junior associate, Marcus Reynolds, looked at me with undisguised curiosity. He was new to the firm, recently graduated from Yale Law with distinguished honors according to the announcement David had brought home. Unlike most of David's colleagues, Marcus seemed genuinely interested in me beyond my role as the senior partner's wife. "Which law school did you attend?" he asked, directing the question to me rather than David, a courtesy so rare in these circles that it momentarily caught me off guard. Before I could answer, David laughed, the sound warm and condescending in equal measure. "Harvard, if you can believe it. Got in on some diversity scholarship, but the real world of law is different from academic theory, isn't it, sweetheart?" "Indeed," I replied with a measured smile, thinking of the Harvard Law diploma carefully stored in my private office safe, the office David believed was just my hobby room for planning charity events. The diploma bore not just my name but the distinction of summa cum laude and the signatures of professors who remained valued colleagues and occasional dinner guests in my professional life. The life David knew nothing about. "Natalie knows where her strengths lie," David continued, accepting congratulations from a passing associate. "Organizing our social calendar, maintaining our connections. She's the perfect partner for a man with ambitions like mine." "You're too kind," I murmured, extricating myself from his grasp with practiced ease. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I see Caroline Harrison arriving." I moved toward the restaurant's entrance where I spotted Caroline Harrison arriving fashionably late. As the judge's wife of 30 years, she had perfected the role David expected me to play: silent, decorative, useful only in social contexts. At least that was how she appeared to men like David and her husband. "Caroline." I greeted her with a kiss on each cheek, the familiar scent of Chanel No. 5 enveloping us momentarily. "How lovely to see you." "Natalie, dear," she clasped my hands in her own, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman in her 60s. "Everything looks wonderful as always. I don't know how you manage to organize these gatherings while keeping up with all your other activities." Her slight hesitation was deliberate, her eyes communicating volumes that her words could not in this public setting. Caroline was one of the few people who knew exactly what my other activities entailed. As a retired federal prosecutor herself, She had maintained her own secret professional life for nearly a decade while her husband ascended through the judicial ranks. Balance is everything, I replied, guiding her toward the private dining room. How is the foundation fundraiser coming along? This question too carried dual meanings. The foundation, ostensibly a charitable organization supporting legal education for underprivileged students, also served as a network for women in the legal profession, navigating the particular challenges of a male-dominated field. Caroline served as its public face. I directed its strategic initiatives under a carefully constructed series of proxy arrangements. On track, thanks to your guidance, she murmured, her voice dropping as we moved through the crowded restaurant. The board was quite impressed with the strategy you outlined. The Singapore expansion, in particular, opens possibilities none of us had considered. We rejoined the party just as David was launching into the story of how he'd single-handedly secured the Westridge contract, the multi-million-dollar client he believed had been won through his legal brilliance alone. I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, sipping it slowly as I watched David's performance, noting how he emphasized certain details while strategically omitting others. What David didn't know, what he had never bothered to discover, was that Westridge International had been my client for years before they approached his firm. As special counsel to their board, I had personally recommended they consider David's firm for their domestic litigation needs, a recommendation made with careful calculation and perfect timing. The Westridge General Counsel practically begged us to take them on, David was saying, his voice carrying that particular timbre it acquired when he was stretching the truth. Said they'd been watching our work on the Caldwell case and were impressed by our approach to jurisdictional challenges. This much was actually true, though incomplete. Westridge had indeed been following the Caldwell case on my specific recommendation. As their international counsel, I had suggested they observe how David's firm handled certain aspects of domestic litigation that would become relevant to their planned expansion into American markets. The evening progressed predictably. David drank too much, boasted too loudly, and continued to introduce me as his supportive wife to newer associates who didn't yet know our story, the version he had constructed and come to believe himself. I circulated through the gathering, maintaining the delicate social connections that David believed were my primary contribution to his career. Mrs. Harrington, Marcus approached me during a rare moment alone near the dessert table. I wanted to apologize if I caused any discomfort with my question earlier, about Harvard. I studied him carefully, noting the sincerity in his expression that seemed at odds with the calculated ambition typical of David's associates. No apology necessary, Mr. Reynolds. Curiosity is a valuable trait in an attorney. Marcus, please, he offered, selecting a miniature tiramisu from the elaborately arranged display. May I ask what area of law interested you during your time at Harvard? Before you, he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with repeating David's narrative of my academic failure. The directness of his question presented an interesting choice. For 7 years, I had maintained the fiction David had created, never directly confirming his assumptions, but never correcting them either. Engaging with Marcus's question would require either perpetuating the lie or offering a glimpse of the truth, a glimpse that could potentially complicate the careful separation I maintained between my dual lives. Before I could decide, David appeared at my side, his hand settling heavily on my shoulder. Trying to get legal advice from my wife, Marcus? I'm afraid she'll be the first to tell you she's more comfortable discussing art galleries than legal statutes these days. Not at all, Marcus replied smoothly, though I noted a flicker of something, perhaps disappointment, crossed his features. We were discussing the dessert selection. Mrs. Harrington has excellent taste. That she does, David agreed, his tone suggesting a double entendre that made me inwardly cringe. It's why she chose me, after all. Later that night, as David slept soundly in our bedroom, I sat in my private office reviewing documents for tomorrow's meeting. The room, unlike the rest of our penthouse apartment, reflected my actual aesthetic rather than the carefully curated image maintained for David's benefit. Modern, minimalist furniture surrounded a desk crafted from glass and steel. The walls held my actual academic credentials, framed but displayed only in this private space, alongside abstract art pieces selected for their significance rather than their decorative value. On my desk sat 3 phones, my personal device that David knew about, my primary business phone, and a secure line used exclusively for my most confidential work. The latter buzzed with a text from Mariana Vega, my chief strategic officer. Supreme Court brief finalized. Ready for your final review before morning filing. I opened my laptop to examine the document, a case that would establish new precedent in international corporate law if successful. The brief represented months of work by my core legal team, addressing complex questions of multinational jurisdiction that went far beyond the boring details David assumed I couldn't comprehend. My name appeared nowhere on the brief, as it did on none of my legal work. For 7 years, I had practiced law under my professional name, my maiden name, Natalie Chen, while maintaining the fiction of being simply Natalie Harrington, the supportive wife of rising legal star David Harrington. This arrangement had begun as necessity rather than deception. When I first met David at a legal conference 8 years ago, I was already establishing a reputation in international law, working primarily with overseas clients who never needed to meet me in person. My practice focused on complex corporate structures and cross-border regulations, work that required brilliant legal strategy but minimal public visibility. David had pursued me with flattering intensity, assuming I was a first-year associate at a competing firm. By the time he proposed 6 months later, I realized he had created an entire narrative about my career and ambitions that suited his worldview, one where I was struggling in a profession too demanding for my temperament, eager to embrace the role of supportive spouse to his rising star. I had initially found it amusing, then increasingly fascinating as a sort of behavioral case study. How could a man who prided himself on dissecting witness testimony and uncovering hidden motivations be so willfully blind to the reality of his own wife's capabilities? The answer, I discovered, was simple. David saw what he expected to see, nothing more. When I received calls from international clients, he assumed they were charity committees or social connections. When I worked late in my office, he believed I was organizing dinner parties or planning vacations. The substantial income from my practice, carefully managed through separate accounts, he attributed to a trust fund I had never actually mentioned, but he had assumed must exist given my Harvard background. I reviewed the Supreme Court brief carefully, making several notations before sending it back to Mariana with my approval. The case involved a multinational corporation's obligations under varying privacy regulations, precisely the kind of complex international issue that had earned my reputation among a select circle of legal experts, none of whom, ironically, included my own husband. My phone buzzed again. Judge Martinez confirmed for 9 a.m. She's reviewed your preliminary findings. I smiled slightly, thinking of tomorrow's meeting. Judge Elena Martinez was one of the few people who knew both versions of me. Natalie Chen, the respected legal strategist, and Natalie Harrington, David's supportive wife. She had watched with increasing discomfort as David dismissed my legal opinions at social gatherings, never connecting the dots between his wife and the counsel whose work he occasionally praised when it appeared in industry publications under my maiden name. The situation might have continued indefinitely had David not crossed a crucial line 3 months ago. His firm had taken on a case directly opposing one of my longtime clients, a conflict of interest that could have been easily avoided had he ever bothered to have a genuine conversation about my professional life. When I raised concerns about the case, suggesting there might be ethical considerations he wasn't aware of, he had patted my hand condescendingly. "Natalie, darling, you're confusing things again. That little legal knowledge you picked up in your year at Harvard makes you think you understand these matters. But trust me, this case is well within ethical boundaries." That evening, I had made a decision. Not out of vengeance or wounded pride, but out of professional necessity and a growing weariness with living a bifurcated life that increasingly felt like a charade rather than a practical arrangement. The plan had been set in motion carefully. First, I arranged for my client to request a specialized counsel team for the case, one that would include both Natalie Chen, appearing only on paper and in strategy meetings, and David's firm, with David himself as lead counsel. Second, I began documentation of every instance where David had received information about my client through our personal relationship, innocent comments over dinner, questions about international regulations that he'd assumed were merely my attempt to understand his work, notes he had left visible on our shared home office desk. Finally, I scheduled a meeting with the State Bar's Ethics Committee, presenting the evidence not as a wife reporting her husband, but as Natalie Chen, counsel concerned about a potential breach by opposing counsel. Tomorrow morning, at precisely 9 a.m., David would be called before Judge Martinez and representatives from the Bar Association to address these ethical concerns. He would arrive expecting a routine pre-trial conference, unaware that his professional reputation hung in the balance. I closed my laptop and placed the phones in their respective drawers, each locked with different security protocols. Tomorrow would bring clarity, one way or another.